Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we're going to be looking at AMD's third generation of Ryzen processors, something we do quite a bit of on the channel, but this one's a little bit different. It's kind of like a family overview, I suppose. The video will serve as a quick and easy reference for those of you wanting to know how all of the Ryzen series compare, Ryzen 3, 5, 7, and 9, as it is rare that we feature all of these series in a single video. For example, when we recently reviewed the Ryzen 3 3100 and 3300X, none of the Ryzen 9 processors were included, as $500 plus parts aren't usually relevant when reviewing $100 to $120 processors, so we remove them in an effort to declutter the graphs. But as I said, it would be for those of you who are interested in seeing kind of the performance across the entire range, well, this will be the video for you. And we have had quite a few people request this comparison with all the relevant third gen Ryzen processors. Relevant as in the models worth buying. There is actually a grand total of 20 third gen Ryzen processors if you include the OEM models and then the uber expensive HEDT Ryzen Threadripper parts. However, for general consumers looking at buying a mainstream AM4 processor, there's just 5 models that we recommend. Though parts such as the 3100, 3600X, 3800X, and even new XT variants are worth buying if available at the right price. But for simplicity's sake, we'll be focusing on the 5 models that we recommend you buy, without having to rely on any special deals, and here's a look at the models in question. For budget shoppers, there's the Ryzen 3 3300X, well, sort of, actually maybe not really. Despite being released 3 months ago now, for the majority of that time, it's been out of stock, and for over the past month hasn't existed anywhere, and AMD can't tell me when stock will return. And the same also applies to the $100 Ryzen 3 3100. So at least for now, the third gen Ryzen series is dead, but we'll include it anyway in the hope that AMD can revive it shortly. Unquestionably, one of the most popular third gen Ryzen processors has been the Ryzen 5 3600, and at $200 US, it really is a great buy. However, it's an even better buy at the moment at just $170 US, a price that it's been trending at now for quite a few months. The 3600 has been our best value, best all-rounder pick for a year now, and we're not alone in that choice. Another very popular option amongst shoppers is the Ryzen 7 3700X. At the launch price of $330 US, it represented excellent value, but today it's extremely good value at just $260 US. A truly amazing price for an 8-core 16-thread processor of this quality. The more premium 3800X has also dropped down from the $400 US MSRP right down to $300, but given it offers very little over the 3700X, we still recommend you pocket the $40 and put that towards a more meaningful upgrade. Then we have the Ryzen 9 3900X, which has also been discounted quite substantially, dropping down from the $500 launch price to just $420. Another incredible buy for the first mainstream desktop CPU to offer 12 cores with 24 threads, and I should note that there's no other 12-core option from AMD. Well, apart from the new XT variant, but that doesn't really count given it is massively pointless. And then finally, sitting atop of the third gen Ryzen family is the mighty 16-core 32-thread Ryzen 9 3950X, which a year on is still completely unchallenged as the most powerful mainstream desktop processor. But despite the lack of competition, it too has received a price cut, dropping from $750 down to $700, so a $50 saving there. Now, these processors work on all 300, 400, and 500 series motherboards, assuming the appropriate BIOS is installed. They officially support DDR4 3200 memory, but will happily operate with up to DDR4 3600 memory, while the better quality silicon will handle DDR4 3800 while maintaining a 1-to-1 ratio with the Infinity Fabric interconnect. Now for testing, I'll be using our standard memory configuration, which sees us fully populate our Gigabyte X570 Aorus Master motherboard with 8GB G.Skill Flare XCL14 modules for a 32GB capacity, and all we've done here is load the XMP profile. Then, as usual, we're also using a GeForce RTX 2080 Ti to help alleviate the GPU bottleneck, allowing us to better look at actual CPU performance. Speaking of which, let's take a look at the benchmark graphs. Starting with the Cinebench R20 results, we see fairly typical scaling performance as the core count increases. Where we see a 33% increase in core count, the performance uplift is around 30%, and in the examples where we're getting a 50% increase in cores, sees around a 43 to 48% increase in performance. For example, there's a 43% performance boost when jumping from the 3300X to the 3600, and then 30% from the 3600 to the 3700X, and 48% from the 3700X to the 3900X, and then finally a 27% jump from the 3900X to the 3950X. Some of those margins will be influenced by the frequency, but overall, pretty much what you'd expect to see. And speaking of frequency, while not the same frequencies that would have been seen for the all-core workload, here's a look at how the performance compares at the maximum single-core turbo frequency. This is again exactly what you'd expect to see. The 3300X clocks 100 MHz higher than the 3600, and therefore it overtakes it for single-core workloads. Then we see a 100 to 200 MHz increase between the Ryzen 7 and Ryzen 9 models, so they scale accordingly. The 7-zip compression results are interesting, as this test doesn't utilize SMT technology all that well, at least for the higher core count parts. Here we're seeing a 35% performance boost when jumping from the 3300X to the 3600, then 28% from the 3600 to the 3700X, 39% from the 3700X to the 3900X, and finally just a 16% jump from the 3900X to the 3950X. The 16-core 32-thread 3950X isn't very well leveraged here, so let's take a look at the decompression results, which do make far better use of SMT. And here we're seeing scaling that's a lot more in line with our Cinebench R20 multi-core results, where we see a 50% increase in core count going from the 3300X to the 3600, and from the 3700X to the 3900X, we're seeing a 50% increase in performance, or thereabouts. Likewise, where we see a 33% increase in core count, we're roughly seeing that kind of margin translate to the performance increase. Blender, like Cinebench R20, can take full advantage of core-heavy processors right up to something like the 64-core Threadripper 3990X, and as a result, performance scales well right up to the 3950X. Though, while the 3900X will reduce the render time from the 3700X by 33%, we're only seeing a 22% reduction when jumping up to the 3950X from the 3900X. Of course, as they say, if time is money, then the 3950X does make sense, but here we are seeing the best balance between price and performance with the 3900X. Moving on from 3D rendering to code compilation, a very different workload that appears to yield very similar margins. Again, we're seeing a massive uptick in performance when moving from the 3300X to the 3600. This time a 45% boost can be seen. But the upgrade to the 3700X is a lot less drastic, though you're still looking at a 23% boost in performance. Then from the 3700X to the 3900X, we see a rather massive 47% performance increase, and then we're back to a 21% performance boost with the 3950X. So again, for productivity tasks, the 3900X delivers the perfect balance of price and performance. The DaVinci Resolve Studio 16 benchmark is interesting as it is a mixed workload. It doesn't peg the CPU at 100% utilization from beginning to end, and this is something we often see with video production software. Utilization is a bit all over the place. The single biggest performance leap can be seen when upgrading from the 3300X to the 3600. Here we're looking at a 16% performance increase. Beyond that, you're getting an 11% improvement with the 3700X, 10% with the 3900X, and then 9% with the 3950X. So surprisingly consistent scaling there. Scaling in Premiere Pro between these CPUs is more in line with the core increase. We're seeing around a 20% boost for a 50% increase in cores, and then a 10% boost for a 33% increase in cores. Again, the 3950X offers the weakest gains, but at the same time, it's also the outright fastest. Photoshop is one of the few applications we test with that still doesn't utilize core-heavy processors very well. Here we're seeing just a 17% improvement in performance from the 3300X to the 3950X, despite the fact that the Ryzen 9 processor packs 4 times more cores. So, if you use Photoshop or any application that doesn't utilize core-heavy processors, I guess the 3300X will do. And it's a similar story with After Effects, though here we do see double-digit gains when moving from the 3300X to the 3600, so it appears as though the 6-core 12-thread processor is the sweet spot for this application. Now, before we get to the game benchmarks, here's a very quick look at total system consumption. Interestingly, the 3700X pushed total power usage just 7 watts higher than that of the 3600, and despite packing twice as many cores as the 3300X, really didn't use that much more power. And we also see that the 3900X is the most power-hungry processor in the 3rd gen lineup, and while you might expect that honor to go to the 3950X, due to a stringent bidding process that sees AMD reserve the very best silicon for the 3950X, the 16-core processor is able to operate at lower voltages and therefore consume less power. Okay, so it's gaming where picking the right processor gets quite tricky. Most of you won't want to waste money over-investing in a CPU you'll never fully use. And this kind of thing is often justified in the name of future-proofing, though it does often make sense to future-proof to a degree. For example, we're seeing virtually identical performance between the 3300X and 3600, even when using a $1,000 graphics card at 1080p. So that being the case, you'd probably just go buy the 3300X, as it is clearly the best tier in terms of value. But spending $50 more in this instance to get yourself the 3600 might pay off in a reasonably short time frame, as games are slowly becoming more CPU demanding, and parts like the 3300X are often right on the edge in modern titles. Of course, if you're on a tight budget where every last dollar counts, then worrying about future gaming performance might be less of a concern, and therefore saving $50 by getting the 3300X might be the preferred solution. But what's clear here is, stepping up to 8 cores with the 3700X has very little impact on Battlefield 5 performance, and going beyond an 8-core processor for gaming is a pointless exercise. Moving on to the Far Cry New Dawn results, and we again find another situation where the 3600 is a little bit faster than the 3300X thanks to the 2 extra cores, and then the 3700X is a whisker faster again, but beyond that there are no performance gains to be seen with the 12 and 16 core models under these test conditions. Quite interestingly, we see that Gears Tactics goes the other way. Though I do believe the advantages we're seeing here are related to the single core performance, as the 3300X matched the 3600 and the higher end Ryzen 9 parts that clock a little bit higher offered a very small performance advantage. Next up we have Ghost Recon Breakpoint, and this is a good example of a game that's not particularly CPU sensitive, assuming you have at the very least a decent quad core with SMT support, which is exactly what you get with the 3300X. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is a really good example of a game that can be extremely CPU demanding, and here we're seeing a significant performance uplift when moving away from the 3300X to the 3600, as here we're looking at almost a 20% FPS boost. Beyond 6 cores though, there is very little to be gained, and again, once we go beyond the 3700X, we're well into the territory of diminishing returns. Red Dead Redemption 2 is another example of a CPU-intensive title, and here we're seeing solid performance gains right up to the 8-core 3700X. The game still plays very well in the 3300X with no noticeable frame stuttering, so that means with lower-end graphics cards, the margins will quickly evaporate. But if you're seeking maximum performance in this title under CPU-limited conditions, the 3700X is the chip to get. There really are a lot of 3rd gen Ryzen processors, but you can really narrow down your choices quite easily, and of course your budget will help you do exactly that. But it is good to know what kind of performance you can get by going up a tier, 1 or 2 tiers, and then how much you'll be sacrificing by going down to save a bit of money. As we saw in the application benchmarks, the Ryzen 9 3900X is the sweet spot for those seeking strong performance, while the 3600 is a great budget alternative. Of course, the 3700X is faster than the 6-core model, but the cost increase is considerably higher than the performance increase, which is why we feel the 3600 is the better all-rounder. Looking at the table shown earlier, but with the current retail prices added and how that translates to cost per core, we see that the 3600 is actually the cheapest option here, coming in at just $28 per core, whereas you're paying a 16% premium per core with the 3700X. Naturally though, if time's money and you need the most performance you can get on the AM4 socket without having to turn to Threadripper, then the 3950X is by default the chip to get, despite its rather high $44 per core. So picking the right Ryzen processor for productivity tasks is fairly straightforward. However, where things become very tricky is when you start talking about gaming performance. And here's a look at the average performance seen across the half dozen games tested and how that translates into cost per frame. As you can see, the 3300X is clearly the most cost-effective gaming processor, coming in at just $1.14 per frame in our tests. However, as seen in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, the 3300X is starting to slip behind in the more demanding titles, and it might not be too long before 4-core 8-thread processors start to become inadequate for the latest and greatest titles, but of course that is yet to be seen. And this is where the future-proof argument starts to come into play. Personally, I feel if you can, spending a little bit extra money to secure the Ryzen 5 3600 will prove to be a wise investment, but going one step further and spending 65% more for the 3700X simply isn't going to be worth it for budget-conscious gamers. So when it comes to the 3rd gen Ryzen lineup for gaming, the 3300X is a solid entry-level offering, but the 3600 is the best value choice in my opinion, while the 3700X is nice if you can afford it, and then again for gaming, the Ryzen 9 parts are an unnecessary luxury. Lastly, it is worth keeping in mind when buying any 3rd generation Ryzen processor that we're expecting 4th gen Ryzen later this year. So If you can, it might pay to hold off on that purchase to see what the Ryzen 4000 series of processors has to offer. The information in this video should still be relevant for that purchase. We're expecting Zen 3 processors to be even more efficient, so the 6-core 12-thread option there should have even more headroom for gaming, which is why it can be a little bit silly to fixate on core count rather than raw performance. Anyway, that is going to do it for this one. If you guys enjoyed the video, you know what to do. There's that thing. You can also subscribe for more content from us. And if you'd like to support the work we do here at Hardware Unboxed and become more involved in the channel and get some pretty cool perks in return, then the link for our Patreon account is in the video description. We'll have a live stream coming up shortly for Patreon members where you can chat with Tim and I, and we talk about things on the channel, behind the scenes, all that kind of stuff. There's also our Patreon Discord, Q&A, BTS videos, all that stuff. But as I said, if you're interested, check the link in the video description. But other than that, that is going to do it for this one. Thank you very much for watching. I'm your host, Steve, and I'll see you again next time.